So I will hand it over to my colleague Didier Bergeret. Didier, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks, Henry, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to see so many of you actually joining this open house call for the CGF Human Rights Coalition. And I can see people saying hi also in the chat box, which is a great practice because you can use that as well to effectively submit your questions. But saying kind words of welcome is always appreciated. So we're going to start with this meeting now. Anyway, it's recorded. But before anything, I just needed to read out loud the antitrust caution because, as you know, CGF is an industry association which has to respect many rules, starting with the antitrust. So please bear with me for a minute. The association shall not enter into any discussion, activity, or conduct that may infringe on its part or on the part of its members any applicable competition law. By way of examples, members shall not discuss, communicate, or exchange any commercially sensitive information, including information relating to prices, marketing and advertising strategy, costs and revenue, and conditions of third parties, including purchasing terms of supply, program distribution strategy. I'm going to move us on to the housekeeping rule, which is that everybody should be on mute when not asking a question. So thanks for that. And as said, when it comes to this Zoom meetings, you're all pretty familiar with it. But if you want us to know who you are, it's appreciated that you can put your first name and last name and company name under your little tile so that we don't have funky numbers or unidentifiable people in the room. Put yourself on mute only if you want to ask a question, which you can do by using the chat or raising your hand. Of course, introduce yourself so that everybody knows who's talking, and please specify to whom of the speaker you would like to ask the question, or if it's to everyone or to a specific person, please again specify it. Any questions you may have towards the CGF team, please use social@theconsumergoodsforum.com to ask your question. Now, I think that most people have been left out of the waiting room, Sirendri. So I'm going to start with the agenda for today, which is of course about welcome. So welcome everyone. I'm Didier Bergeret, and I'm delighted to be joined by my team, Nadia Buns and Sirendri Kishti Sabrina, for this open house call that hopefully will give you all the necessary information you need to have to effectively understand what we are trying to do with the CGF Human Rights Coalition working to enforce labor, and hopefully count many of you as members in the near future. I'll be joined in a second by our Human Rights Coalition co-chairs who will be giving their remarks. And then we're going to build around the Human Rights Coalition business case and why it's such an important coalition for our industry and a vital coalition for CGF members. We'll take time to take questions throughout, so please don't hesitate to effectively use the chat box or raise your hand if you really have a burning question. And then we'll follow up with Human Rights Coalition members' testimony from Colgate-Palmolive Company and also from Unilever. Gabriella and Claudine will give their views on why the coalition is important and what it helps do for them within their companies when it comes to mainstreaming important systems to target human rights due diligence. We'll try to leave as much time as possible for Q&A at the end, and then we intend to be closing in less than an hour now this meeting. So again, welcome to you all, and now it's my pleasure to effectively introduce you to our HRC co-chairs, starting with Veronika Puncheva from Metro, the retailer Metro, who will be followed by Paul Lally from the Coca-Cola Company.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Didier, for the introduction, and please join me in welcoming Paul, who actually joined our coalition relatively recently as co-chair. And for all of you on the call, I think the fact that you are here to spend your time discussing and learning more about the work of the Human Rights Coalition of Action working to end forced labor, which is the whole name of the coalition, is great, because we all see how governments, how NGOs, how the civil society is now increasingly focusing attention, especially in the last couple of years, on human rights. There have been important societal developments which also point that businesses need to step up and businesses need to take more responsibility with regard to human rights. Human rights somehow feels a rather heavy and intense topic. And when we talk to some of our CEOs, I would say there is not always this kind of energy or enthusiasm in comparison to some other topics, because people sometimes think or feel that if they start talking or associating their brands with the discussion around forced labor, they could be considered somehow linked to that and associated with forced labor per se. Actually, it's rather the opposite, because we see already a lot of companies, and many of them are on the call, many of them are part of the coalition, who have been courageous in the last years and decades in addressing forced labor, because they know that they're connected to specific commodities. And I'm just going to name a few. Typical is cocoa or palm or coffee, but not limited, of course. And they have been addressing forced labor in their practices in order to be clear about what they can achieve and how can they move the needle. And this is happening. So our coalition here is a very down-to-earth group of people, very practical, and a group of enthusiasts and experts who aim actually to help the companies and the businesses to address these topics. Because truth is that none of us, nobody can say today that we are 100% sure that we do not have any forced labor, would it be in our own operations or in our supply chains or both. So let me pause here and invite Paul for a couple of introduction words, because actually we hope to have a conversation with you, not that much of a presentation, and hope to be able to answer and address some of the questions which hopefully you're going to ask us. Paul, over to you.
Thanks, Veronica. Thanks for that introduction, and Didier, you as well. And hello, everybody. It's great to be on the call. Thanks for joining us. You know, it's interesting. I am probably a good person to talk with all of you today, because while our company has been a longstanding member of this coalition, I'm relatively new, as Veronica mentioned, because I joined the Coca-Cola company in February of this year to take over as the Global VP of Human Rights. And I was formerly the head of human rights over at GE. And so I've been able to personally kind of learn early on what this coalition brings to the table. And it really is, and as we'll talk through today, and I want to make sure we leave time for dialogue and Q&A, but it's really been, as Veronica mentions, an incredibly practical support group for all of us to deal with this challenging issue of forced labor that we all recognize we have to deal with throughout our supply chains globally, as well as our own operations. And what I've seen in just the 4 or 5 months that I've been co-chair with Veronica is kind of several ways that the coalition supports at least our team here at Coca-Cola in driving kind of compliance and human rights in this space. One is just the invaluable dialogue that it brings whenever we're together of peer companies at all levels of maturity. There's not a call that goes by that I don't come away with something that I can practically use in our program, which is really what I think all of us are looking for. Because we're so busy in this space that we really need kind of practical guidance, and that's what this group really brings. And then we'll talk about the resources that it brings to bear, both internally within CGF and then externally. You can't get that kind of combination as easily as we do in this coalition. And so it brings perspectives that we need and then support that I think all of us need, because of, we're all kind of stretched thin from a resources perspective. And then I'd finally say the important public facing commitment that being a member of this coalition means for all of our companies. We are all pressured to be very transparent and strong in our public facing commitment to fight forced labor. And this is one of the spaces that is both safe and incredibly valued, I think, publicly as a commitment to enhancing programs to fight forced labor in our own operations and supply chain. So I think in all those ways, and we'll talk about them a little further, I've found this to be one of the most valuable groups that we belong to in the human rights space. And we're kind of looking forward to going through that a little further today and then answering all of your questions. Didier, back to you.
Yes, many thanks, Paul. Many thanks, Veronica. It's indeed very valuable to have you as co-chairs. Now, I mean, I think the audience would like to know exactly what the coalition human rights working to end forced labor has been designed to do. And so what are its main objectives? But also, and I think you already tapped into that, but why do we focus so much on forced labor? Why is it important for us to effectively decide that out of the Pandora box that human rights can be, our industry has decided to focus on forced labor as its most salient impact and as the topic of this coalition? I'd like to address those questions to you, Veronica, as well, the long-lasting and always a supporter of the Human Rights Coalition co-chair.
Well, thanks, Didier. And indeed, these are good questions, because we all know that there are plenty of other things which we can potentially address and focus. But the focus on in the coalition, our objectives are actually, we can call it threefold. And the first one is, we can call it taking good care in own operations and in selected supply chains. And this is about implementing human rights due diligence systems, targeting forced labor in these two layers. So this is equally important, because often we see in our operations third-party providers, whether it be cleaning companies, whether it be transportation companies, and these are people who work on our premises, and it's very important that there are no forced labor practices in that field. And it could sound sometimes unusual, but it's actually happening. So understanding how to recognize them, how to address them, what to do is very important. Same is for our supply chains, but this is a lot more complicated, because we know that supply chains could be very, very long, and we don't have enough visibility of what's happening there. Therefore, in the coalition, we have selected one supply chain, and this is palm oil. Why palm? We can say that palm is pretty much present in nearly every product which we put on the shelf in the retail, and nearly every product which is produced in the manufacturing area, whether it be in food or non-food. The second objective is about supporting responsible recruitment markets. So turning our view from the due diligence part for the implementation part. Responsible recruitment markets, or the practices of our partners, of the agencies who are recruiting people for our operations, is something which we want to specifically address in the area or in the supply chain of palm oil. And specifically when we talk about recruitment markets, promote the advancement of responsible recruitment markets, initially in Malaysia as an important labor corridor. So of course we could potentially say that we are interested in all corridors and all countries, but in this coalition we believe that we first have to move the needle in a specific area, specific geography, in order to be able to prove our concept and to show results. And the last point is around advocacy, because supporting through focus movement, we want to partner with governments and institutions to create the climate for change area. And this can be only done with a collective effort. With regard to the forced labor per se, we know that the International Labour Organization globally estimates that 40 million people are affected or victims by modern slavery. And these are data from 2017. It's probably safe to say that the COVID development, the COVID pandemic has increased these numbers. We don't know where we stand today as an effect of COVID, but most probably it's not less. And if you look into the sectors where this is happening, a lot is happening very close to us. It's happening in manufacturing, in agriculture, in wholesale and trade. So 16 million out of this 40 are in the private sector and domestic work, and 80% of which we are focusing on are in these 5 parts of the economy: construction, manufacturing, agriculture, accommodation, and food, wholesale and trading. And I think that answers to the question why forced labor. It is difficult. It's difficult to detect, to measure, to recognize. There are methods, but we know that they are not capturing to the full extent of the whole problematic, and there are not so many robust and solid approaches. In the same time, forced labor is a topic which carries enormous reputational risk, but it also represents limitation or issue for companies to take the right decisions, and also for governments a specific area to be more active.
Well, thanks a lot, Veronica. I think that sums it up quite well. So we do intend to work on forced labor in on operations to make sure that we clean our house first, in supply chains to make sure we partner with our suppliers to effectively get to the same point that we owe to be, and target like some overarching issues like responsible recruitment, which today, because of the lack thereof, is still generating new forced labor cases every day. And now we know that debt bondage is also like half of the forced labor cases we can find in our supply chains. So with that at hand, we also want to create a movement with all stakeholders and all organizations. And then I'm very happy to see that many of our partners are also on this call, like IDH or ICS. Now, I would like to ask a question to Paul, notably given his experience in the matter, now at the Coca-Cola company, but also previously at General Electric. Paul, so if forced labor is our most salient issue that is faced globally across sector, but largely by retailers and manufacturers, why would it help companies that really want to go into a thorough due diligence process to take forced labor as a key starting point for that?
Well, Lydia, it's a good question, and there are really several reasons. And I'll start with the slide you see here, and I think many of us are aware of this now, but there's been just this significant movement over the last several years from a soft to hard law world in this space, whereas in the past there was guidance on the issues of human rights, and really the focus globally when it comes to human rights has been significantly in the area of forced labor. And when you saw the numbers that Veronica just discussed, you can see why. It is really what governments and NGOs are singularly focused on as the priority issue in the area of human rights. And the governments are now catching up to that, not only previously with just reporting laws, but now they're going into the next step, which is really laws mandating due diligence steps in this space, that companies are required to do a certain minimal level of due diligence or potentially be exposed to certain civil or possibly criminal penalties. And you see this happening, primarily this transition is happening in Europe, both within countries such as the Netherlands, France, and Germany, but even across the EU. And that undoubtedly will spread across the globe. So now this is becoming a significant compliance issue for companies, all the way to the board level as they look to put these obligations on directors. And that's not the only area of pressure that we're seeing in this space. Regulatory pressures, as I just mentioned, are significant. We all know investor scrutiny in this space is just increasing rapidly as these large institutional investment funds and a lot of the benchmarking that is done for these funds are focused on what are you doing as a company in the area of due diligence, and in particular forced labor. So they are asking to see that, and they want to see maturity, and they want to see continuous improvement. And then we're talking about reputational issues for companies, and that's undoubtedly a big issue. And when you see the numbers, we all are going to face forced labor risks and problems in our supply chains. The answer isn't immediately whether you've eradicated it all, but whether when you have issues that come up and potentially come up publicly, can you demonstrate that you're doing everything you can to eliminate it and taking the appropriate steps from a due diligence perspective? And then from a business need, we just need to be able to ensure that our supply chains and our own operations are free of this to the degree that we can, and that we're continually trying to do so. So let's say those are all kind of the pressures we're facing. What does CGF bring to that? You can see on this slide all the kind of resources it brings to bear in the areas that it focuses on. I just want to step back from a company perspective and say, this is an overwhelming issue to face. We all face as a company, the issue of forced labor. And our supply chains are vast, and our resources internally are always limited regardless of our size. So we need resources outside to help us in this space. We need to be able to engage stakeholders. We need to be able to kind of clarify in this space what is appropriate for business, and then we need to be able to act. And I believe that all those issues are what CGF, this coalition, brings to bear. It brings together the coalition of stakeholders that we need, and we get to actually publicly kind of set the dialogue in the space appropriately for what companies should be expected to do in this space, and then be able to act on it. Didier?
I was again trying to get myself on mute. So you definitely like highlighted the case for getting onto a human rights due diligence journey because of investors, because of consumers, because of regulations, and there is effectively pressures that are being placed onto companies that should get them to understand the need to move on to that lines. And of course, being part of an industry group that helps everyone getting there could be a good way forward. Now, I mean, technically, it's still probably blurry for some. Why do we talk about HRDD as a new evil acronym, which means human rights due diligence? It's been repeated many times. It is a hot topic now for the industry and globally, but what are we exactly talking about, and why should we act so urgently about it? I would like to get Veronica to help us understand this question and possibly answer it.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Didier, again for this all very insightful questions. I'm going to repeat the line which Paul said. With our approach on human rights due diligence, we aim to make the complex things simpler, not simple, but simpler. Because human rights due diligence is a step-by-step approach for the companies, which actually means that companies need to proactively manage potential and actual human rights impact which they are involved in their business practices. So it's based on the United Nations guiding principles and on business and human rights. It is actually a 6-step approach. I'm not going to spend now time technically on how this is done, but I would like to assure you that in the Human Rights Coalition of Action fighting to end forced labor, we are going to actually keep each other's hands and make sure that we are following this step-by-step approach in a simple and very pragmatic way. And there are actually 3, that was too fast. There are 3 key areas in that you need to understand your risk. You understand as a company where beyond normal corporate processes, for example, an audit, etc., you have a risk linked to forced labor. Is it in your supply chain? Is it in your own operations? Is it both? How does it look like? Then you have to be able to address them in collaboration with stakeholders, and you have to be transparent about it. So nobody's expecting that companies are perfect, but it's expected that companies are outspoken about their issues, about what they do, not only about the good stuff, but also about the difficult stuff. And if we talk about human rights due diligence, why? Why now? So you can also move probably to the next slide. It's all about regulations on one side and on societal attention. And societal attention is for me here twofold. It's media, it's NGOs, and it's also investors, actually threefold. We see that regulators are very enthusiastic, very active. We have seen a couple of new acts. So the latest one is the German Supply Chain Act, but we expect this to happen also on EU level. We also see, for example, United States acting on that. There are specific orders issued by the Border Protection Control because of alleged forced labor. So there is a direct link to our business. And there is also an opportunity for us to build our value proposition from industry-wide collaboration with other FMCG counterparts in order to be able that we have a consistent approach to the industry. It's not only the reactive part, what I'm trying to say, but also the proactive part, be ahead of the game and to get our companies and businesses as good as possible prepared for this rather lengthy and complicated process. Does this answer your question, Didier?
It definitely does. And I think that what we understand from that is that this is a real urgency. And yes, it can look complex, but actually working together may help every company on this call to effectively get there faster. And this is a need for our industry members, but this is definitely a need for all the victims currently today of forced labor that are being trapped in jobs without being paid, with their passport retained, or with other conditions that no one would accept for their own self or their own family members. So that's why, I mean, it's important also to remind everyone the need of leadership against something that should be an issue of the past, but it is unfortunately something that is very much effective today. I think that we do have time to take some questions from the audience, if there is any at this stage. If none, we can move us on with typical aspects of the Human Rights Coalition for everybody to better understand how we function. But again, we want this to be a dialogue and not a masterclass. So please feel free to raise your hand or take the floor or use the chat box. If nothing at this stage, I'm gonna move us on. But as I said, we have planned a few minutes, like 10 or more, in the end of this session to answer all the questions that you may have. So I don't see anyone raising his hand, nor anything on the chat box. So, well, I'll think that we can move on. And again, possibly for you, Veronica, can you explain us a little bit how this coalition effectively works when it comes to governance? And I think that you could eventually address a question that just popped up, which is how this coalition work is also connected to the SSCI, our own CGF Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative.
Yeah, I think I'll try to answer that. Maybe you can show the governance. Yeah, thank you. The governance of the coalition follows the structure of all other coalitions, which means that we have coalition co-sponsors. These are Steve and Veronique from Marks & Spencer, so the CEO of Marks & Spencer and co-CEO of Danone, respectively. These two co-sponsors are part of the CGF board, and they are also, all coalitions are reporting to the governance committee and to the board. We have the coalition co-chairs, which is Paul and me. And then we have the coalition steering committee, which is based and which is created by members of the coalition, expert in the field, coming from the companies, many of whom are today on the call. And in the coalition work, we have the 3 projects. We call them project number 1, number 2, number 3. Number 1 is about human rights due diligence in all operations. Number 2 is about human rights due diligence in supply chains, specifically on palm oil in Malaysia. And number 3 is about enabling responsible recruitment markets. Now, we have also partners with whom we cooperate as project management and also in implementation. The partnership has been created based on a very detailed and thorough selection process. So we decided to work with the Fair Labor Association and the International Organization for Migration, who are very knowledgeable partners and who are also very solid and strong in project management. So they provide this implementation support. And if you can get back to the governance, yeah, or the participation, exactly. Today we have members of the coalition across the globe from strong US-based partnerships and representation starting from the Coca-Cola company where Paul works to Walmart, Mondelez, Mars, name it. So you see all the partners on the slide, and apologies if I did not mention all of them. Also strong representation of businesses in the EU and United Kingdom, and also increasingly interested and strong membership in Japan and in Southeast Asia. You see the names of the companies today. on the bottom, these are also a couple of observers. So we are open coalition. We give chance to people to understand how they can get connected to our work. So far, we have a list of observers. We hope to see them as active members of the coalition as soon as possible. And we would like to invite all of you on the call who are not yet there to become part of that coalition. Would it be as a member, or in worst case, or let's say, or later case, if you're only an observer today. With regard to the project content, project number 1, as I mentioned, is human rights due diligence system focused on forced labor in our own operations. What we aim is that by 2025, to make sure that all companies who are part of that coalition reach a leadership stage. And I'm not going to spend that much time on what leadership means, but we have 2 other steps before leadership, and which are described. So actually the coalition is very open for companies who are very early in their work or who are very advanced. But we aim that everybody gets to the level of leadership by 2025. The project number 2 is linked to the palm oil supply chain. And what we want to do there is build capacity of suppliers to monitor, address, and prevent forced labor issues in own operations and extend the supply chain via the human rights due diligence. And we are focusing here on the tier 1. So tier 1 is also linked to upstream own operations of selected palm oil suppliers in Malaysia. So we know that it's probably a first step. We want to go to the bottom of this question, but our first focus in the supply chain of the palm oil will be, as I mentioned, the tier 1 suppliers. And the project number 3 is developing and support for responsible recruitment markets, because we know that we need to cooperate with our partners from the recruitment agencies. So we want to promote practices and engage them in practices which are in line with our understanding, our values, and our objectives. And again, the scope is tier 1 and own operations in Malaysia. Probably, yeah, a short question on this, on the SSCI. So, slide disappeared. Didier, maybe you can.
Yes. No, we're just looking for a slide trying to highlight this functional linkages between the various relevant coalitions at CGF. And thank you, Alden, for this question. So take it from there. The Human Rights Coalition working to end forced labor helps a company start its journey when it comes to due diligence at own operations level and taps into a pilot supply chain with a very, very relevant commodity, while at the same time making sure that we can address endemic societal and global issues like responsible recruitment. And that's why we are working hand in hand with also relevant organizations. We'll go into a bit more in detail later on. Next to that, we have a work stream at CGF that's called the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative, which already looks at making our due diligence processes for supply chains better. And so therefore, they are mutually supportive. What we know is that forced labor is an obvious issue, but very difficult to detect, largely with the typical approaches that we use, like audits, monitoring systems, certification, standards, you name it. Technically, every company had for years, Chapter 1, no forced labor as part of their code of conduct, but we never had as many cases as forced labor today, so we may have been doing something wrong. So whatever we'll do at Human Rights Coalition level will inform the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative, which is designed as a benchmark of all these tools that we can use to implement supply chain due diligence, and that helps us in defining who to work with, literally by pinpointing all the relevant elements that we want to find from a standard, certification, or audit scheme perspective in terms of what they should cover and how they should cover it. And so that's where those two coalitions help each other. The Human Rights Coalition may inform the elements that need to be benchmarked to guarantee that, yes, responsible recruitment is adequately checked by the monitoring protocols that standards have in place. And in parallel, of course, the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative helps put a threshold on what needs to be adequately checked and effectively guarantee to our members that there is a heightened level of trust that they can have in the standards that are officially recognized by the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative. In parallel to that, a third coalition we are naturally connected to, not only because of palm, but largely because deforestation is a human rights problem, is the Forest Positive Coalition of the CGF, where we try to make sure that the commodities that are driving deforestation are also integrating the social element and make sure that when we talk about forest positive, it also includes being people positive. So zero deforestation, zero conversion, but also fair and decent working conditions for all forest-related workers, starting by the avoidance of forced labor at all costs. And Malaysia is a very interesting geography to start with, because there are large demand for labor force to come into Malaysia to work in the palm oil sector. And we know that this migration corridors are where most of the workers are being charged with fees that generate debt, which leads to a forced labor situation around debt bondage. So we're trying to make sure those are truly connected and that they help driving the industry faster towards a global encompassing sustainability agenda. I hope this answers your question, Alden. And if no questions more, I suggest we move on with an additional question, notably to Paul, because we heard a lot about FLA, the Fair Labor Association, and the International Organization for Migration, two key organizations that has been selected and are now project partner to help and guide us in the implementation of our objectives. Why, from your perspective, Paul, is it so important for us to partner with such a key organization, and how does it effectively contribute to the success of the coalition?
Yeah, I think it's one of the critical components of this coalition is the way that it can connect and bring these kind of support resources and outside stakeholders to help us kind of, as I mentioned, continuously improve our programs. It is both the support, the knowledge, and the perspective that they bring to the subjects that we're addressing. For instance, as we're currently working on our own operations, human rights due diligence, our Project One, and the FLA support, we've just had 2 or 3 calls so far, and obviously we as a company have a significant due diligence program within our own operations. But just what I've seen so far from what resources and perspective the FLA has already brought to this discussion, I can see opportunities for improvement in areas that I may not have seen before because of the work they've done in this space. And it brings a level of credibility to the work we're doing as well. So I think having these organizations involved in driving these projects, and certainly the IOM with their expertise in responsible recruitment, which is a critical component of eradicating forced labor. The work they've already done immediately takes us to a certain level in the dialogue and the work that we can do that simply we couldn't get there quickly on our own. So they're both reasonable in understanding the challenges we face as companies, but they drive us to be better, and they bring answers and solutions and training that it would really be difficult to get on our own. So I'd say that's really, to me, Didier, the reason why they're so critical to this journey of ours.
Could not agree more. And their expertise, but also their learning journey, given their experience they had over the years in trying to stamp out forced labor, will definitely help ours. And because we all need to admit that we don't have those answers, but maybe together we can get there faster. But so, Paul, I mean, obviously for me, there is a business case to join the coalition. And I think that many CGF members, if not all, should be part of this great group, because there is safety in figures, but there is also progress together to be expected. But in your view, what is the good element, the good argument that you would like to share with people listening today about joining the HRC and working with us?
Well, and I'll be brief on this to make sure we have time for, because I'm looking forward to the testimony from our other members as well. But I'd say there's several respects to this, what we provide as a coalition and what I think all of you can really get out of being members. First, as we've mentioned, it really is the resources that we bring to bear. It's an incredibly cost-effective resource for what you're getting for being part of this coalition, the expertise, the peer knowledge, the organization. I think it's based, and I've been participated in a number of organizations over my time running GE's and now COAT's program. And I think we've all been parts of certain organizations that either are helping us a lot or aren't helping us enough for the time that we're putting in. This one, the value you get for the time and the money that you're putting into it is one that I've not seen, frankly, in many other organizations that I'm part of. I think the practices that they bring, and I think it's important because a lot of companies may ask, well, what kind of commitment am I making by joining this? And Veronica mentioned it early on in her remarks. We are a very practical group when it comes to what we're going to state publicly about the commitments we're going to make. And I think it's very telling that we started our journey in this space focused on our own operations, about due diligence in our own operations, which we all have some level of within our companies, but we recognize we can do better. That was a very logical, reasonable step to take and be able to take publicly about what we're going to do in our own due diligence operations by 2025. That's the kind of practicality this group brings that I think we all can feel safe being members of it, knowing that we're not going to put any of us out there too far and make unreasonable commitments. We know the challenge that this is. We know how overwhelming this forced labor problem is. So we're going to be reasonable as we bring ourselves along in this journey. And then we have members who are at varying levels of human rights due diligence in their own internal journey, with very mature programs, with programs that are just starting, and everywhere in between. And we don't, what's critical about our coalition is we don't simply assume you're at a particular level and then we only focus on that level. For those with very mature programs, you still have opportunities to improve in this space, as I'm learning every day as part of this coalition. With those who are just starting or starting to develop programs in this space, we as members who may have more mature programs see it as our responsibility to help those who have programs who may not have as many resources bring theirs along and improve by bringing our experiences to bear. So I think that's an important piece. One more issue to bring up is the amount of resources you need to bring to the table in this. We all recognize that we're stretched thin as companies, and we have a lot of work that we need to do. This coalition requires certainly some commitment from a resources perspective internally, but again, I think it's a reasonable one. We average 2 to 4 hours of calls a month in this space from your various resources across human rights and sustainability. And Didier, if you want to expand a little more on the resources that are expected to be provided by coalition members, that might be helpful.
Yeah, sure. And we can move on to the next slide, which is, of course, the purpose of this call. The next steps for us are for you to join the coalition and participate in the various working groups and meetings. Technically, Project One, it's deemed to be for every member of the coalition, because we believe that maturity on forced labor starts with acknowledging that we all have a problem with it. And if you think you don't, well, implement a human rights diligence system that should effectively show where in your own operations there might be a problem and that you want to avoid at all costs. In terms of resources, so for everything that is on our own operations, we're going to have self-assessment tools, risk assessment tools guiding you into the selection of the relevant operations you want to cover first. And of course, try to put a baseline for each company to implement elements of what we call a maturity framework, moving you from a launched system to a well-established one, then to a system around human rights diligence that be considered as a leadership one. And the idea for all of us is to move on into this maturity journey and guarantee that we are all at a decent level, allowing us to identify, prevent, report, and of course, remediate forced labor risks. And that's everything you get for project one. On project two, again, it's engaging with suppliers. We implement the same approach because we want to partner and not be in a placing expectations type of approach that has some benefits, but technically doesn't work if you really want to change the mindset of companies at supplier level and get them to understand that we're all in this together, and that only by working together on similar tools, we can effectively stamp out forced labor. Last but not least, in terms of resources that are largely available, then thanks to the power of the group, working on responsible recruitment would be practically impossible by one company alone. If we want to do positive advocacy towards governments so that they change the systems and they help us implementing the objectives we assign ourselves, we need to have a dialogue. And the possibility of such dialogue doesn't rely, well, it's difficult within one company, but with the group and with the support of the International Organization for Migration or the International Labour Organization, we can get there, hence enhancing our corporate leadership by showing that we understand the problems, we know we can't solve them alone, but it doesn't prevent us from trying, and then acknowledging the difficulties and challenges we face so that we can try to overcome them in a relatively short future. But now, I mean, all of this can effectively be best expressed by some members of the Human Rights Coalition. So I would love to call to the floor our representatives from the Colgate-Palmolive Company and from Unilever. So Gabriella Lopez from the Colgate-Palmolive Company and Claudine Musitelli from Unilever. Gabriella, I'm going to start with you. You are effectively the newest member of the coalition. So it's interesting for us to understand your perspective because, well, as every company in the coalition, you kind of have to be involved in project one on operations, but you are also starting to show very big leadership on project two when it comes to palm oil. So what got you into the Human Rights Coalition group?
Yeah, thank you, Didier, for the question. And let me start to say that Colgate sustainability strategy is rooted in 3 pillars: people, performance of our products, and planet. And really, CGF has been a great opportunity for collaboration and work with peers in different initiatives. So we started to participate in sustainability projects as a CGF member, and we also found a terrific opportunity to be part of the Human Rights Coalition, which makes totally sense with our people pillar. And we all know that we are committed to human rights, no? That's why we are here. However, there is not a single company that is going to achieve the goal to eradicate the forced labor on their own. So because it can be challenging and also complex. So for us, really, the Human Rights Coalition is bringing us the opportunity to build a network with peers and to share and learn best practices. So furthermore, as a global company, we are committed to comply with all applicable laws. So I would like to say as well that Colgate-Palmolive has a long-standing commitment to mitigate forced labor risks in our supply chain. And really, this coalition is raising more the bar, so we can promote positive changes through focusing on collective actions.
That's effectively a very important point you're making. Long-lasting commitment can effectively benefit from joining those types of groups because, said, if you want to go fast, you go by yourself, but if you want to go far, you go together. So if this is the sentiment I understand, I hope that others do as well, and that they get into the coalition despite the level of leadership or maturity when it comes to those issues. Talking now to Claudine, well, Unilever is typically one of those companies considered as being mature and very much at the evolved end of all the social sustainability matters. You are Director for Social Impact, and Unilever is part of the 3 Human Rights Coalition project. We effectively get a lot from you on Project 2 when it comes to Palm, and on Project 3 when it comes to responsible recruitment markets. We're still in the early stages when it comes to the coalition, but what has been your experience so far being involved in these projects?
Hi, Didier. Thanks for the question. Well, look, I'm going to repeat a lot of what has been said so far, which is a good sign, because that means we're aligned, which is necessary to drive change. I won't shock anyone by saying that the topic at hand is one of the most complex ones we have to tackle. Many different types of stakeholders involved, total lack of transparency, and the fact that an entire business model has been built on people's exploitation for many years. So I was quite encouraged by the fact that the industry via CGF has managed to create a space. And I would echo Paul on the fact that, you know, I've been in many, and I'm still in many groups, but this space is actually looking at tackling the issue rather than talking about it again and again and again, right? We've all been there. So there are a couple of reasons why I think this collaboration has a shot, and anybody who knows me knows I'm rather direct. First of all, and it's been said, and it's extremely important, it covers the whole value chain, starts with us, includes our suppliers, and includes all the many stakeholders that need to be talked to and worked with in order to drive change. It's critically, it's all interrelated. So you can't just isolate one party and just work on one party. All of us have a shared responsibility we share. I like the way the system is built on a consistent and a sound, consistent basis of the approach, which is the human rights due diligence maturity metrics that now the audience would have heard from a few times, which allow us to progress over time across the whole project. Again, it's consistency. I like consistency. Usually it's a good sign moving forward. Great expert support, FLA and IOM. I mean, I worked with them separately on other projects. They're solid. The plan is solid, but it's a challenging one. But that's what's good about it. Again, it's not about talking, it's about doing. And also it's about doing with others. We're looking at beyond CGF, which I like too. I don't like territoriality at all. And so it's important to understand how to work with others. It's important to understand that everybody along the value chain is a business in its own right, right? It's not just retailers and brands, it's also our suppliers alike. And we need to build this as a shared responsibility model, not a top-down one. And that to me is very important. And that speaks more to 2 and 3. But by taking our responsibility through 1, we lay the ground for good collaboration moving forward. So it's a challenging space, let's face it, but it's a safe one. And you've heard that from my colleagues, right? Or my peers. It's the merit of it is we're building it together, and the progress will be different. Unilever is said to be faster, maybe not, I'm not sure, to be honest, with so much more to learn. Some companies may take more time, but inertia is just not an option, and working on it, moving together is what's going to really drive change. And that's what I've seen in those groups. Everybody can speak, it's open, things change, we move together, and strength is in number, right? As you said. So I think that's, for all the reasons, the experience has been rather positive. Challenging, again, I want to underline that, but that's a good thing.
I would say that nothing worth doing is easy, as they say. So challenging is actually the good one. I'd have so many more questions to you, Claudine and Gabi, but I think that like our audience also deserves the right to raise those questions. So I will ask Veronica and Paul, also our great speakers for today, to join us in taking all the questions that the audience may have. Chat box, raising your hand, the time is yours. A few minutes left, but a few very precious minutes for you to raise all the questions you may have towards our great speakers of today. And please don't leave me alone, because otherwise I'm going to talk some more and you don't want that.
Yeah, I see a question coming from Vadim from our company.
I see that.
How do you measure efficiency of progress on human rights delivered by coalition members. I think of course the devil is in the details, and that's a very good question, Vadim, because we have in our roadmaps actually very precise deliverables by year, by project, what needs to happen, how that needs to be measured. And this is actually the huge value of that coalition, because if today you are new to that conversation, people don't know where to start, or they don't feel very, very comfortable with that knowledge, which probably Unilever and Colgate Palmolive already have since many, many years. And you can have an entry point no matter how advanced you are or how much a beginner you are. So these measurements are available. Probably Didier, you can give examples of that. And what is also available is that, or I just want to underline it, this is probably the most economic way to address the whole topic of human rights due diligence, because also due to the fact that there is so much of regulatory efforts, there are plenty of people out there with consultancy offers, with a lot of great experience, who are offering services and ideas and assistance, etc., and this is all great. But I think here in that group, we have the collective knowledge and expertise of, I dare to say, the best in that industry, and the best in terms of our in our cooperation partners. So there is not only a plan how to, but also a lot of knowledge what to do. So, and I'm going to pause here because otherwise I'll be talking too much.
Yeah, and we can't go into the detail of how we measure, but we do have metrics in place and KPIs. We accept that the ones we have may evolve over time. So we will track progress from members in a self-declarative way, but we'll have in place many safeguards allowing you to guarantee that you are covering the right things in terms of risk priorities, doing the right actions in terms of targeting forced labor, and benefiting from the power of the group when it comes to delivering on progress. I see we have a question from Ian MacLeod. Ian, it's a pleasure for me to give you the floor. We've been bumping into each other a few times lately. Can you please introduce yourself for the rest of the audience?
Yeah, my name is Ian MacLeod. I'm the Group Chief Executive of the Dairy Farm Retail Group. We're based in Hong Kong and have retail stores across Hong Kong, China, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, and one or two others besides. So just on this particular issue, I mean, clearly nobody can deny that human rights is not an important issue that any sort of responsible person should be concerned about. But specifically in relation to the two challenges that you're looking at, in terms of the human rights due diligence processes that have been identified, first question is there a CGF sort of checklist to say if you want to put in good due diligence processes within your business on human rights, what's the sort of checklist that we should be putting in place to go and check with our, I'm thinking about our own brand suppliers. So what do we need to do to go into these areas to see whether these are core requirements we can have? We can make up our own, but is there a checklist rather than reinventing the wheel that exists that we could sort of tap into? That's the first question. The second question is in relation to looking at responsible recruitment processes and the linkage between, looking at palm oil specifically as an industry and Malaysia specifically as a country within that industry. Are those two areas being identified because there is evidence or suspicion that there is strong human rights abuses of workers within that industry, within that country?
I'm going to take that question first, but Veronica, Paul, Claudine, Gabriella, please feel free to complement. So yes, checklists we do have for your own brand suppliers, and they are exactly the same ones we want you to implement across your own operations. And that's the beauty of this approach. Let's practice what we preach so that we can talk more constructively with suppliers, admitting that we all may have a problem, but that we are all looking for solutions. So yes, we do have that. Many are being finalized, but we have most of the product. And of course, as everything, it will evolve over time. Next to palm oil in Malaysia, yes, I mean, palm oil is a sector under large scrutiny. Loads of efforts already happening, but not the capacity to put an end to forced labor as we speak. And so because it's so important for both our food and non-food members, it's been taken as the critical commodity. And Malaysia, there has been allegations of issues there. Malaysia is also one country that effectively recognizes that there are problems. Without having all the solutions at hand, they moved away from denial. They are what they call a pathfinder country to implement the International Labour Organization protocol against forced labor. So it felt the right place to engage in a constructive dialogue from a positive advocacy perspective. And so we know it's not perfect, but we feel that there we can effectively make some greater moves. Last but not least, in Asia, you have sending countries when it comes to migrants, and you have receiving ones. And Malaysia is a big receiving country. So there may be at a space where people come to look for a job full of hopes, but end up being in debt bondage. So in a situation of forced labor, which prevents them from sending money back home the way they should, and of course from being a worker treated with fair and decent conditions. So that's why we took all of these into account through stakeholder consultation, and this is why we opted there for those actions there, with the view that everything we do has to be replicable, scalable, manageable, but also sustainable, as Claudine, my former colleague, would say. So that's exactly why we did this.
Thanks,
Okay,
Ian,
thank you.
for your participation, for the great questions. I think it's a sign of very strong leadership to have the CEO of Dairy Farm asking these questions. So really very grateful for that.
Definitely grateful. And I know we passed 3 minutes over time. So Paul just put his email address there. You have ours. What I'm suggesting now is we're going to have to close the call to be respectful of the time. Everything we shared today will be, of course, available for all participants, and much more information can be extracted from us at CGF and from all the participants that hopefully showcase to you the business case to come and work with us to put an end to forced labor. So thanks again all for your time. Thanks a lot, Ian, Paul, Veronica, Claudine, and Gabby. It's been my pleasure. And of course, thanks to my team, who is pretty essential in getting all of this to you. So have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Didier.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, guys. Have a great day.
Take
Bye-bye.